Hi, class, and welcome to the video lecture for film report number 4, The Male Divine and the Trickster. Um, so, to begin with, I just want some old business. I do think a lot of you by number 3 are starting to catch on a little bit more. So I was encouraged by some of what I saw in your presentations and rough drafts. A big thing still I'm not seeing is one central focus. So again, let's not forget what you've learned in your other writing classes. Let's have a thesis statement and kind of use everything to support that one major idea. And that'll allow you to, usually, as I've kind of modeled with some other examples, that'll allow you to bring in other interpretations, interpreting some of the symbolism within the film and or the textual myth that you're comparing, contrasting with, under that overall concept. Usually, especially if it's a thesis statement that deals with cultural hegemony. And I think the fascist aesthetics of Pan's Labyrinth is a great example of that. The Same Old Other Mother is a great example of that. So lots of interpretation of various myths and or symbols within the films, but all leading to one central point. The Same Old Mother is that it's really, while on the surface it might look like a feminist film, it's really not a feminist film. This anti-fascist aesthetics of Pan's Labyrinth suggests that while that it gives a new idea of what fascism is, not limited to Nazi Germany or even Franco, Spain under Franco or Italy under Mussolini, but is something that we're always dealing with. Every culture has elements of it that are fascist, and provides a new way for myth to counter that. So those are some examples. But to kind of keep with this idea of cultural hegemony. One thing that might be helpful here is to think not to think of cultural hegemony as anything that's very direct and obvious. In fact, that's really bad cultural hegemony. Is the idea is that a good way to think of it is a newspaper. And so here's an example of this. In fact, there are some schools of thought, I should say, there are some schools of thought that argue that whatever the dominant ruling class will control everything that is produced by that culture, so that the only way you can get a subversive message is through non-mainstream outlets. So it'd be some sort of um, underground newspaper, something like that. And there are good arguments to be made for that. Whoever owns and controls production says something about what gets produced. And so there are some good arguments to be made for that. Personally, I think that's too strong. I think that there are ways that counter hegemonic impulses get through even into the mainstream sometimes, right? But my classes tend to go the other extreme and assume everything is counter hegemonic, and that's in large part because we are products of this culture that we live in. So of course we see this as sort of so it resonates with our own self-image, and we're in a way taught to think of ourselves as rebels in a sense, in a weird way today. So the newspaper example is good here because, of course, all of the newspapers in this country, and not only newspapers, but media outlets, etc., are owned by corporations, right? And so certainly you're not going to have a lot of anti-corporate news stories put out in the media because the owners are not going to like that, right? But at the same time, you're not going to sell many newspapers if all you do is talk about the stock market and sailboating and golf and things that the wealthy class are interested in. You've got to find a way to sell newspapers. You've got to speak to the majority, and that's the working class in this country. And so to do that, you've got to find a way to appeal to their interests, and that also means appealing and identifying to some degree with their complaints. The complaints of, you can't just say everything is rosy and nice if it's not. That's not going to go over very well. So in other words, you've got to find a way to put that angst into your reporting or whatever, but in such a way that it's not going to lead to the overthrowing of the system, that it will still ultimately reinforce the status quo in some way. And I think the films we're looking at for film report number 4 are really good examples of that. Now we've seen some already. If you go back to say Harry Potter and is a good example of, on the surface, it seems like they're criticizing this kind of fascist impulse. And it seems on the surface, too, that it's very much about collective power and, Harry and his friends and so forth. But on closer inspection, you look at the house elves, who seem to be happy to be house elves. And um, we could add other examples to that as well, the way muggles are portrayed and on and on. Certainly, they're not seen as equals or meant to be seen as equals. So what we ultimately get is this idea, and I think we see that in these films as well, is an idea that, okay, there's some problems, but let's not trust the people to solve these problems. Let's just chastise the people who are already in control to do a better job. In other words, it's still promoting a kind of oligarchy, which is that it's the people in power haven't done a good job, so we need better people in power. So, in other words, it's very anti-democratic in that sense, and I think we certainly see that in these films. Batman, one of the articles that you can read on that, and I think it's a good one, suggests that Batman is sort of a king, and if you think about it, he is. He's not elected, and but he controls Gotham. He's the king of Gotham in many ways, and he becomes king because he's a different kind of superhero, and in that, unlike so many of the other things we've seen that are sort of on the surface anti-capitalist, Batman is a capitalist. He owns a company, he produces, etc., and it's also his capitalism, his riches, that make him a superhero. It's not because he was born with superhuman strength, because he's an alien like Superman or something like that. His superhero skills come from technology, which is created by the company he owns, which is a weapons manufacturing company. So I think that's telling. And that's where he gets his superpowers. He doesn't get it from the law. In fact, he is a rebel. He's a criminal. Um, so the criminals he fights, he's a criminal too. So he operates outside of the law, much the way a king does. The king makes the laws, but he's not subject to his own laws in a monarchy. So that might be something worth exploring, and I'll go into some other things in a second. Um, but So I want to talk about the articles. That there's a lot of good ones for this one that I think are really helpful in interpreting cultural hegemony. They're all under the contents tab, and they're all under Mel Devine, and they are one is called Batman and Hegemony. Cartooning the Body, that's not specifically about superheroes or about either of these films, but I think it tells us something about the sort of cartoony violence that we see in these films, that we see in, say, Mission Impossible and on, and what that says about our culture and how we might interpret that, especially as it relates to the trickster. Trickster makes the world. Trickster Trump, if you're into Jung and you want to see a Jungian analysis applied to our current president, you might be interested in that one. The Trickster and Patriarchy, that's just a short one that touches on the question, why are the tricksters always male? Why don't we have female tricksters? In a sense, we do have female tricksters. They're witches, right? In other words, why is the trickster male kind of tolerated in culture, but a woman who is a trickster figure is seen as a kind of threatening, seductive force that needs to be kept under wraps in many civilizations. So it explores that theme a little bit. And Batman's right-wing turn is a really good one. There are also a couple that aren't in that section. The one on the Avengers, which deals with the issue that I think is an important one of superhero popularity. It's the biggest franchise in the movie world right now, and that's interesting. It wasn't too long ago when the only people interested in superheroes were adolescent boys, but now it's a major phenomenon um, in adult culture for men and women. The Comic Cons are a good example of this, and of course, just the blockbuster numbers of these films. So that touches on that. Another one that might be helpful is sci-fi as myth. That has some relevance to this one as well as the next one, where we're going to look at the apocalyptic in film and myth. So yeah, take a look at those. Um, some other things I think, just to go back. The issue that we've seen, like in Harry Potter and some of the others, this issue of meritocracy, this message that you can do it if you work hard and you're skilled and talented, that's really what decides what rises to the top and what doesn't. We can argue that that's really ideology at work, not reality. So if we're sending that message through our film, are we reinforcing ideology, or is that an accurate reflection of reality? So a few things I want to talk about with this one. I'll link to this in below if you want to take a look at it. But this so-called sorcerer figure of Troy Frere, and I apologize for my bad French. I don't know how to say that word. But this is a figure that was found in one of the caves in France, the La Chaux cave. Um, and it's often used to kind of represent the male divine as a prehistoric image of what we mean by the sort of primordial male divinity. And there are two ideas in that. Jimbutus, who we talked about with the female divine, she suggested that this is a representative of the dying god, much like that, sort of an ancestor descended from this original goddess Kohart. Remember, if we go back to the Paleolithic, when there's some evidence that maybe it was culture was more matriarchal, societies were more matriarchal, that every year a male figure was made appointed king and married this female goddess and would be sacrificed at the end of the year to make way for the new crop. Um, Eventually, the kings appointed substitutes to take their place, and then it suggested that it was just effigies were replaced by instead of real people, so that this was a symbolic act, and so that the king could maintain power. And this might be an explanation for how we move in from matriarchal cultures to patriarchal cultures. If, like I said, there's not a lot of evidence about Paleolithic culture, and it's hard to make generalizations about that. But that's one idea that's put out there. And so for Jimbutus, then the goddess represents the cosmic order, sort of the Dionysian almost, this universal aspect of life. And the male then becomes this ephemeral quality of individualism, and as such becomes a consort of this goddess and the rising and falling of the sacred king. Other mythologists, Leeming and Page, for example, suggest that that figure that she talks about is not, in fact, a god, but a shaman, and might represent hunting magic. Some of this idea that that cave art represents hunting magic has been discredited a little bit due to the fact that we now know that many of the animals depicted in these caves were not animals that were common in those areas at that time. So they were more exotic animals. And it's worth noting, too, that this so-called sorcerer of Troy Freres, I'm going to link to it, is one of the very few depictions of a human, right? So we know the drawings were made by humans, but almost all of the drawings depict animals of various sorts. So with that in mind, just as we did with the females, and we talked about some of the primary archetypes there, I'm going to talk about some of the archetypes for images of the masculine divine or male divine. I don't think these are quite as helpful as the female archetypes were, because I think there is a but the female archetypes we can clearly see by looking at the archetypes that are emphasized in a culture, what that is saying in some way about what the culture wants from its females, right? And doesn't want, even more importantly. But with the images of masculine divine, it's a little trickier because the masculine, unlike the dyads we saw, where we saw a female natural juxtaposed with the same female force, but within civilization, here all of the male divine figures are socio-political. So they're based on sort of socio-political roles, um, as they manifest themselves in different cultures. And there are five kind of divisions of this. The first one is fathers and sons. So the father is the male fertility figure, and the son is often seen as a mediator between this male fertility figure and the human and natural world, um, that in many cases he creates. The next category are kings and judges. The king is often the sort of father representative of this father force, and judges, we are dealing with both judges of actions in life and in death and afterlife. So King Solomon is a good example of someone who combines both of those, fathers and sons. Obviously, Jehovah Christ is a familiar one. Next, saviors and sages. So savior figures are often seen as human exemplars. And when we're talking about male divine, that's an important one. So they often kind of bridge the distance from the father, become the human exemplar of what we're expected of, what is expected by the father from humans. And then the sages who teach those saviors what that um, exemplar should be, in other words. Next, the tricksters and the shamans. And we're going to go into more depth about tricksters in a second. Here, though, we're talking about characters that traverse secret roads and are mediators between worlds. And then finally, the lords of destruction and guardians of the underworld. Hades is a guardian of the underworld. Shiva is a good example of the Lord of Destruction, as he dances his death of destruction to bring about a new cycle of birth and eventually another destruction. So those are the kind of categories for the archetypes in this one. Whether you find them useful or not may be another question. I think these are a little trickier to fit in than with the female divine. But I also wanted to talk briefly now about the trickster figure, which we're kind of giving emphasis to. Keep in mind, we've already done a lot of work with the hero figure, which is usually male in a culture. And so a lot of that carries over to this, right? When we look at the male divine, a lot of what we're looking at is an idea for what the ideal person within that culture is supposed to be, right? And so it's less limiting than, say, what a female ideal might be. This is a case where we look for someone to model both. So these are the models of society. So it tells us a lot about cultural hegemony. What do we want people to do? What do we want them to think? What do we want them to feel? All of those questions are kind of dealt with the male divine. And then the antagonist to the male divine, oftentimes a trickster, might in some cases represent what the culture is threatened by and needs to keep under wraps. If, in fact, the trickster is seen as sort of an evil force, and that's not always true. In Africa and Native American traditions, the trickster figure is seen as another god, and as more of a savior figure that bridges this gap. And one of the things that we might look at then is the way the figure of the trickster mediates between the sacred and the profane. So a few, and I'm going to come back to that, but a few kind of things, 10 aspects you can find these useful. I'm not sure if you'll find these useful or not, but some of the aspects of the trickster. One is the creator trickster. Prometheus is a good example of this from Greek culture, to a culture bringer. Anansi, the spider god of African traditions, is a good example of that. The trickster is opportunist. Joppa another African one. Jacob from the Bible could represent this too, as stealing his brother's inheritance. Um, as mischief maker, Loki is a good example of this. Bugs Bunny is one you're going to look at too from our own times. Um, Amorous adventure in Native American tradition. If we were in class, I would read a little bit from. I can't find a copy. I can't copyright it to give it to you, so I usually just read it to the class. Called Saucy Duck Feather, about um, a character who finds a way to get, who goes inside of a tree and pokes out. So anyway, it's sort of an X-rayed as a story, but is a story about a god, a trickster figure in Native American culture. A hunger-driven manipulator. Another Rose. There's a story of Rose Hips, in which a trickster figure um, challenges some crows to a pooping contest after he's eaten some rose hips that makes him poop all over, and the winner of the pooping contest gets to keep the deer the raven have just seized control of. So it's another example there. Credulous victims. So tricksters are victims as often as they are manipulators. Lazy work avoider. You might look at our own tradition of Huck Finn, for example. And the trickster as a transgressor, Pa Pandora from the Asian tradition, and as a clown of the body. So those are some of the characteristics of tricksters that work here. As we look at the trickster in these two films, we're focusing either on Loki or on the Joker. So one of the things, if you look at Loki, how does Loki differ from the Norse Loki um, that is in the assignment chapter? So you can just look it up in the index to read about Loki, um, or even kind of go online. You can find, but be careful to find accurate stuff there, and contrast that with this film depiction of Loki, which is quite different. So that might be telling about how the differences in these trickster figures might tell us something about what each culture finds threatening or doesn't. Um, so the Joker, on the other hand, I think one of the interesting things, and one of the articles touches on this about this Joker, and a couple of things to address. One is the popularity of the Joker. So now we have a whole film made just about the Joker that came out last year. And even when this film came out, there was all kinds of fanzines, etc., with the Joker. This is the Heath Ledger Joker we're going to take a look at here. So why is this Joker figure so popular? And more to the point, why is the trickster so popular, not just in our culture, but even more universally? But looking at our own culture, we can see the trickster figure rise up not only in characters, cartoon characters like Bugs Bunny. We can see it in things like punk rock, um, and numerous other ways. And so it might be interesting to explore that. Why is the Joker so um, um, prominent in our culture today? What does that tell us about our culture? And for this particular Joker, one thing you might look at, how he differs from some other depictions, is his. One of the things I really like about the film, and I think that might be very counter hegemonic, even though for the most part I think this is a hegemonic film, and both articles kind of argue for that. But one way I would argue that it's not hegemonic is the Joker's lack of interiority. There's one theory out there that suggests that one of the ways in which um, our hegemony maintains itself today, um, different from the ways other cultures have maintained hegemony, is that once upon a time, maybe we got people to buy into capitalism by pointing to the future and saying, look, in the future, capitalism is going to bring this great, beautiful world of flying cars and everything's, computers will do all our work for us, robots will, and we'll just sit back and everything will be so easy and nice. Well, none of that's happened. Instead of flying cars, we have robocallers when we call the help desk and all kinds of things. And so instead of looking to the future to justify it, one of the ways that can be done is two ways. One, and I think we see it in this film, is by saying that, yeah, things are bad. And I think this film says and gives voice to a lot of criticisms of capitalism, just as you have to, and like that newspaper example, but says that the solution to the problems of capitalism today is to just have a better capitalism. In other words, the same people should be left in charge, or not the same people, but the same class of people. In other words, instead of really villainous rich people, we should have really nice savior like rich people, such as um, Bane. I forget what his first name is. In other words, Batman, um, when he's not in his superhero outfit. So that's one thing, and I think you see that in this film, and I think you see it especially if you've seen the next film. I think that's really good to bring into this, the film that features Bane as the villain, and you kind of see an echo of the Occupy movement with that. And one of the things that both that film and I think all of the other Batman films of Christopher Nolan suggest is that the solution, there's lots of problems, especially with financial capitalism, but the solution is to have better people in charge, right? Have the nice capitalists in charge instead of the mean capitalists. Um, so certainly, I think that's there, and there's sort of an anti-people power message that comes with this film. That's a lot more direct and overt than, say, Harry Potter. But where it might be counter-hegemonic is to go back to this idea of disavowal and this lack of interiority. I want to read you a quote that the Joker gives in this movie. Um, so, the, and here he's talking to Harvey Dent. You see, nobody panics when things go according to plan, even if the plan is horrifying. If I told people that a gangbanger was going to get shot or a busload of soldiers was going to get blown up, nobody would panic, because it's all part of the plan. Tell people that one tiny little mayor is going to die and everyone loses their minds. Introduce a little anarchy, you upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos. I am an agent of chaos. And you know the thing about chaos, Harvey? It's fair. So it's interesting. Usually, the way we depict villainy is someone who's super selfish. And the Joker's not selfish. He doesn't even care about his own life as he's laughing, plummeting to his death when before Batman saves him. And here we get some idea of what the Joker might represent there. And this is important because by not looking inside and giving him a rationale for his villainy, that he had a bad upbringing or something like that, um, we challenge this idea of disavowalism, which is when, okay, we all live under capitalism, we all support it and so forth, but I can kind of disavow that as long as Starbucks is a multinational corporation that that is in charge of all these things. But on the other hand, it tries to buy coffee from poor farmers in Mexico or something. And so I can, what they do with the left hand, I can stop thinking about that, because with the right hand, I do a little of the opposite, right? So even though here's all this capitalist stuff I do with my right hand, I give a little. And then we pay for that. We pay a little extra for Starbucks because it makes us feel good in our conscience. So in a way, we can allow capitalism to continue, right? But inside, not feel culpable and not feel responsible for that in any way. And we can internalize our problems, right? The reason I'm depressed is not because there, we have a increasing number of crap jobs and fewer really high-paying good jobs. That has nothing to do with my depression. I'm really depressed because my mom was mean to me when I was young or something, right? So that's and that kind of is disallowed in this film. And so the Joker, in a certain sense, represents pure terror. In other words, terror detached from any cause. So I think that's something interesting in the film. The masochism of the trickster is very interesting and might be worth exploring. Otto Rank has some ideas about masochism that might interest you. Also, the cross-dressing of the trickster. To go back to that patriarchal question of the trickster, one of the things the trickster often does, though, is that he can In fact, with Loki, he becomes a woman, a sort of a woman, animal woman, but and gives birth, right? But in this film, we see him dressing up as a nurse. We see the trickster Joker dressing up with like a nurse. Bugs Bunny seducing Elmer Fudd. We see this a lot. So that's something else I think interesting and worth exploring. So I think that's all I have to say on this one. So like I said, I was encouraged by some of what I've seen with the third one. All of you, for the most part, have gotten to the point where you're now kind of giving your own thoughts, and I do see interpretation now in every film. Let's not summarize. We don't care about summarizing. Assume your audience has seen the film, and just start right with your interpretation. But let's now try to give a more general, broad thesis statement that everything in the paper will support. That'll be the different. That'll be what moves us from the B's into the A high or low A's into the high A range and so forth. So as always, shoot me an email if you have any questions about anything, and make sure you use the email that's on the syllabus, not the other one. So, and so, yeah, I'll post the due dates and everything on the announcements. Everything is going to kind of go the same way. It's on Tuesday that the final of number 3 will be due, and your new rough draft or / presentation for number 4, which is the Bell Divine. So hope everyone is doing well still, and we'll talk to you at the next video lecture. Bye.